The Wrong Devil. The Livebait Cycle 1. By Salvatore di Montferrat. Edited by Karl Lerchik. My dear Wormwood, it is funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds. C.S. Lewis, The Screwtape Letters. Why This Is Hell, Nor Am I Out of It. Christopher Marlowe, Dr. Faustus. 1. Professor Adrian Weiss never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The room leaned toward him with the soft, voluntary discipline of people who had paid for their chairs and wanted to get good value for the price. In this case, the value was feeling sophisticated. It was one of those university auditoriums designed to look as if nothing important had happened there in the last 200 years. And nothing important would happen in the next 200. Clean stage, clean lectern, clean seal on the wall behind him. A banner stood to one side like a polite servant. Somewhere in the back, a camera's red light blinked steadily. The moderator held up the hardback so the title faced outward. Getting a Bargain from the Devil. Faust from Marlowe to Goethe and beyond, she read, and the title did what titles are meant to do. It promised mastery without sounding like a threat. She set the book down and ran through the introduction the room had come to hear. 3 New York Times bestsellers, the chair at the university, the prizes, the TV appearances. The introduction was the usual brass, and for once it was earned. His scholarship was real, his contribution to the field undeniable. In other words, Weiss was brilliant. The audience knew it. Weiss knew it too. A small laugh rose from the audience, admiring, not derisive. Weiss smiled in the practiced way he had learned over years, warm enough to invite people in, restrained enough to keep them aware that he was the one at the front of the room. The first question was predictable. The second was worse. By the third, the audience began asking not about the book, but about the reassurance it offered. "Is Faust still relevant?" a man in the second row asked, "in a world where the old bargains don't seem to apply?" Weiss nodded as if the question were the beginning of an argument rather than an anxiety. "Faust is relevant," he said, "because the impulse is permanent. What changes are the costumes, the hunger for mastery, the belief that one can step outside ordinary limits and still remain oneself. Marlowe's Faustus imagines a bargain with a cosmology. Goethe's Faust imagines a bargain with knowledge." Weiss leaned forward, lowering his voice the way professors do when they want the room to feel chosen. This was the part people came for. "In the old manuscript illuminations," he said, "the devil is basically stage machinery. Horns, smoke, a fork, it's all external." A few chuckles. "Then the devil grows up, the fork disappears, the method improves. By Goethe, the truly dangerous devil is the one who bargains. He needs your signature. He needs you to participate. Evil gets less theatrical and more competent." He paused. Not for drama, because the pause was part of how his mind moved. Sentence, breath, sentence. "The devil," he continued, "is a function, a voice that insists there are shortcuts without costs, that acquiescence can be given in exchange for outcomes." He said the word acquiescence with a faint emphasis, as if rescuing it from misuse. "In other words," Weiss said, smiling a little, "the devil is always, at some level, a negotiator, a rhetorician, a seducer, an expert in human rationalization." People nodded. They always did. It was comfortable to imagine evil as intelligent, because it implied the possibility of counter-intelligence. Someone asked about modern equivalents. Someone asked about politics. Weiss declined the bait gently, with the tone of a man moving a child away from a hot stove. "I'm wary," he said, "of flattening myth into commentary. But I will say this. What makes the bargain possible is not force. It's pride, the belief that one is too sophisticated to be tricked. For that reason, vanity is the devil's favourite sin. A blonde with alluring green eyes sat with her posture a touch too composed for a public lecture, barnard pin bright against a high-collared blouse that looked chosen for modesty and did the exact opposite. When she spoke, the Slavic tint in her English was faint but precise, the kind that made men listen harder and women decide instantly to dislike her. "Dr. Weiss," she said, "but what about Goethe's lines that serve as an epigraph to Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita? The devil as a force that wills evil but works good." Weiss felt the room's attention shift toward her and then, annoyingly, felt his own do the same. Weiss considered for a moment, or maybe pretended to for gravity. It's a tempting line. People like the idea that evil is secretly an instrument of moral accounting, but most people don't come out better off from the encounter. Ivan Ponyrev might be the exception, but even he didn't escape unscathed. A warm murmur rose from the audience, half laughter, half approval, before the moderator gestured toward the next questioner. "Could you talk about your research process?" a woman asked from the aisle. "How you approached the sources and who helped you?" Weiss brightened in the small way academics do when asked to describe labour as if it were virtue. He thanked a foundation. He thanked a colleague in Heidelberg. He thanked a graduate seminar whose students, he said, were sharper than the literature assumed. "And, of course," he added, "Margarita Brandt did a great deal of the archival legwork. Margaret has recently stepped away from academia for personal reasons, which is a real loss to the field." He said it without sentimentality, a professional courtesy. A few heads turned at the name, a few people scribbled it down. The moderator nodded sympathetically. The audience made a small sound of collective civility. The conversation moved on. 2. After the presentation at the signing table, a small group of people was thanking him for clarity and insight. The line moved slowly. He inscribed each copy with a practiced flourish, the same signature he had been perfecting since graduate school, and enjoyed the brief, repeated moment of eye contact that came with it. The blonde from earlier appeared with a copy of his book in her hands, and Weiss felt the same annoying pull of attention. "Ah, the Bulgakov scholar," he said, pleased with the line. "Columbia?" "Barnard," she corrected, without the smile he'd left room for. He waited for her to make something of the moment. The flattered student, the lingering question, the business card. People usually did. She only held the book, not yet offering it, watching him. "Make it out to?" he asked, pen ready. "Galana," she said. He wrote the name, taking slightly longer than necessary, and found, to his mild irritation, that the clever thing he'd meant to say about her question had not arrived. He signed beneath it instead. "Are you looking for a research assistant position?" he asked, handing it back. "You clearly know the material." "Thank you, Dr. Weiss." She took the book and was gone before he found the rest of it, and the small failure stayed with him a moment longer than it should have, the way a word on the tip of the tongue does, before he let the next person in line take its place. After the last handshakes and the last jokes about counting fingers, Weiss went to dinner with 2 faculty members and an old friend from graduate school. It was a restaurant with low light and quiet service, and the kind of menu that treated food as art and wine as an argument. They toasted him. They congratulated him. They argued about whether myth was ever separable from politics. Weiss smiled and fenced lightly, enjoying the familiar sport, a controlled dispute with rules everyone respected. 3. He arrived home late, pleasantly exhausted, still carrying the faint warmth of being affirmed in public. The house was dark and still. He hung his coat, He moved through the familiar rooms with the comfort of routine. Everything was where it belonged. He walked toward his study. The light was on. Weiss stopped. It was not the bright, accidental light of a lamp left on by mistake. It was composed, intentional. The desk lamp threw a cone of warm illumination over the center of the room, leaving the edges in shadow. Someone was sitting in Weiss's chair, not perched, not nervous, occupied. The man had his booted feet on Weiss's Persian rug as if the rug were his. He was turning pages in a folder on Weiss's desk, with the easy intimacy of someone reading his own mail. Behind him, in the dimmer parts of the room, were others, one leaning against the bookshelf, one near the doorway, another by the window. Their positions were not random. They were placed. Weiss's first thought was stupidly mundane. Robbery. His second thought was worse. Wrong house. He felt his mouth forming words before he'd chosen them. The polite default. The voice for strangers in your home who must have made some error. Can I help? He did not finish. A figure moved from the doorway faster than Weiss could process. There was a sharp, crushing blow to Weiss's face that emptied him of language. Not pain at first, but removal. As if someone had reached into his skull and switched the lights off. Weiss hadn't been punched in his entire life. He fell. His shoulder struck the wall, then the floor. His breath left him in an ugly sound he didn't recognize. For a moment, there was only the carpet against his cheek and the frantic problem of air. He tried to push up. A boot came down on his forearm and stayed there, not searching for balance, not slipping, just planted. The kind of weight that didn't ask whether anything underneath it was still human. The man in Weiss's chair did not hurry. He turned another page. He looked up only when Weiss made noise. Weiss blinked, trying to force the room back into coherence. He looked at the man's face and saw, for the first time, not anger or urgency or greed, but a kind of calm certainty. Then something in the room shifted. Weiss could not have explained it. He only knew, in the part of him that predated language, that he was not looking at a man. Something older than thought, deeper than his atheism, recognized what stood before him. Not a man. Something else. The certainty was animal and total. The figure rose. He walked toward Weiss with unhurried ease, as if this were an appointment that had started exactly on time. He crouched so Weiss could see him without moving too much. "I'm Belial," he said. Not a flourish, not an announcement. The way someone states their name at a reception. Weiss knew it to be literal truth, not an affectation. Weiss opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first but air. Weiss knew who stood in front of him, and yet his mind, still desperate for banality, tried to restore the crime frame. It reached for police, for procedures, for the idea that there were consequences. "You're in my home," Weiss managed, and hated how thin his voice sounded. Belial's expression suggested Weiss had said something irrelevant, like a dog-ate-my-homework excuse from a student who had failed the course long ago. "What do you want?" Weiss asked, and the question came out less like an assertion of agency than a request for mercy. Belial nodded toward the folder on the desk. One of the others stepped forward and placed a few sheets on the desk beside the lamp. Weiss saw paper, a pen, the geometry of documents, and felt a reflexive, absurd surge of relief. He knew how to do this. He wrote his thesis on it. He wrote the book. He knew every trick. Language, terms, a lever. Weiss seized it. "If there's something to sign," he said, forcing his voice into the tone he used for negotiations, "then let me see the contract." Belial laughed. A real laugh, brief and bright, like someone offered a joke he'd heard 1,000 times, and still enjoyed because it revealed something consistent about people. "Contract?" Belial said. Weiss stared. "There is no contract," Belial said, still amused. Weiss tried to speak again and discovered that his mouth and tongue were no longer cooperating on schedule. "You're not agreeing to anything," Belial continued, almost kindly. Then his eyes flicked to Weiss, and his smile sharpened. "Not, how did you put it? Acquiescing. You're just signing it over to us. That's it." Something inside Weiss collapsed that had nothing to do with bone. The last thread of the world as procedure went slack. "What is it?" Weiss asked. "What are you talking about?" Belial watched him for a moment, with a faint interest, as if this were the only part of the evening that might still surprise. "Your soul," Belial said. The word fell into the room without drama, not an incantation, not a threat, a designation. Weiss's mind recoiled. Souls were metaphors. He had made a career out of metaphors. He had dismissed them gently. He had smiled at them in rooms like this very room. But this time he couldn't have summoned a smile. His body heard loss. He heard himself beginning a sentence and couldn't finish it because he didn't know which sentence he meant. "I don't believe. I don't have one. I don't want to." Hands came down on him. Not careful hands. Confident hands. They rolled him the way you roll a man who no longer gets a vote. He tried to struggle and got hit in the solar plexus for his trouble. Once, then again, timed to his breath like someone teaching a lesson. A laugh came from somewhere in the room, short and pleased, as if Weiss had just done something predictably stupid. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't fight. He could only be held. Someone steadied his wrist. Someone pinned his ribs with a knee, pressure precise enough to be instructive. Someone else took his hand the way you take a hand that has stopped belonging to its owner. Weiss felt then a sudden bright interruption, pain clean enough to blank the thoughts he was still trying to assemble. He made a sound that contained no language and no argument. Above him the pen dipped and scratched across paper. A pause, more scratching, his name written without him, in his own blood. When it was finished, the pressure lifted. Not mercy, completion. Belial stood. The others shifted with him, as if obeying an unspoken cue. They began to leave the way they had come, without hurry, without looking back. One of them, on the way out, tossed something onto the desk. It landed with a soft, wet thwack. Weiss lay on the floor and shook. He could feel the wetness on his face. He could feel the absence at the end of his right hand, even before he looked. He listened stupidly for a final speech. A warning, a metaphysical flourish. Some line that would confirm this was a story and not a fact. None came. The group moved out of the study. Footsteps down the hall, the quiet sound of a door opening somewhere in the house and then closing again. Silence. 4. Weiss did not know how long he lay there. Time had become blunt. Eventually he rolled onto his side, cradling his hand, and pushed himself up with his other arm. He moved into the bathroom and turned on the light and saw what he did not want to see. He bandaged himself with the awkward competence of a man who had read about emergencies and never needed to perform one. He did not call anyone. He did not know who to call. Police belonged to a procedural world. This had not been procedural. When he returned to the study, the desk lamp was still on. The papers were still there, neatly aligned as if someone had cared about the arrangement. The room looked almost ordinary, which made the ordinary look obscene. Ordinary except for the small, dark pools across his desk, slowly spreading and drying. Only then did he notice the envelope, placed beside his book as if it were part of the night's mail. Cream paper, heavy stock, embossed letters, a few red droplets already turning brown at the edges. A wedding invitation. He stared at it for a long time, unable to make himself touch it, as if touching it would be an admission of belonging to the same universe as it did. Finally, he opened it. Margarita Brandt and Leonard Cohen, CPA. The date, the venue, the polite, ordinary logistics of other people's lives. Weiss read it twice, then a third time. He waited for the meaning to arrive. None arrived. What arrived was colder. He had told the auditorium she'd stepped away from the field, in the tone of a man describing the world's proper order. The invitation corrected him without raising its voice. Her life had not collapsed. She had chosen another world, one in which he was, at most, a footnote. There was no tragedy in it, no lesson, only irrelevance. He sat down slowly, not to reclaim the chair, but because his legs no longer trusted themselves. Goethe lay open where he had left it. His severed index finger rested on the page like a grotesque bookmark, pointing at his own marginalia, half finished. The devil he had written about for years, the elegant one, the one who required consent, who won by rhetoric, had not come. Another had come instead, and it had not argued because it had not needed to. He had made the mistake Faust always made. Not disbelief in evil, but the assumption that it would arrive in a form his sophistication could manage. He had not been outwitted. He had been crushed. He found his pen. He held it awkwardly. It slipped once. His hand trembled. He adjusted. He could feel the missing finger as a constant, a punctuation mark at the end of every movement. He pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him and wrote a title at the top. He stared at it for a long moment, then crossed it out and wrote again. Not because the title mattered, but because it was the only kind of control still available. The control of naming. Outside, the city continued. Cars passed. A siren rose and fell somewhere far away. The world went on doing what it did, untroubled by the question of whether anyone's soul had been signed away in a quiet study. Weiss wrote anyway. Not as resistance, not as warning, not even as confession. Because writing was what he did when coherence failed. It was how he kept the world legible, even after learning legibility did not bind everyone. Epilogue. The call came in at 9:40 the next morning, placed by a doctoral student who had arrived for a scheduled meeting and found the front door unlocked. The responding officers noted a rear window forced from the outside, soil tracked across the study carpet by at least 3 distinct boot treads, and dried blood on the desk consistent with the victim's injury. The homeowner was found unresponsive over his papers, his right hand wrapped in gauze with a competence the EMTs described as amateur but adequate. The severed digit was recovered at the scene and photographed where it lay, in the gutter of a German edition of Faust, beside a line of verse underlined in the victim's own hand. Blut ist ein ganz besonderer Saft. No significance was attached to it. The digit was not reattachable. No knife, shears, or comparable instrument was located on the premises. The victim's statement, taken at the hospital that afternoon, was recorded as fragmentary. He named his assailant once. The name does not appear in the report. He stated that a document had been signed in the study, in his blood and without his participation, and then taken. Asked what the document conveyed, he said, his soul. The detective wrote unknown intruders, 4+, and further down, in a field meant for other things, victim presenting symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress. The police quickly determined that the motive of the home invasion was robbery, though certain details were inconsistent. Electronics, cash, a watch appraised at more than a detective's monthly salary. Present, undisturbed. 2 items were determined to be missing after an inventory assisted by the victims department. The first was a gold Roman fibula, a bow brooch of the kind a man of rank would have worn at the shoulder in the 1st century. An explanatory note supplied by a victim's colleague and appended to the file recorded that the victim had bought it at auction with the entire advance from his most recent book, and that he had prized it because it resembled one worn by Petronius the Arbiter. The note ran to half a page. The second missing item was a set of corrected galley proofs of that same book. The published edition, available in stores for $29, remained on the desk. No significance was attached to that as well. A wedding invitation, opened, was photographed and returned to the desk as having no bearing on the case. No suspects were identified. The case was never closed. It was never especially worked either.